Hi, everyone. I'm Marianne Shablasi. I'm going to be your instructor for human growth and development. And I know you already had a rough start, but we're going to do our best to make this the best course you ever had. So I've already posted these first 3 lectures on Blackboard for the PowerPoint, and I'll be posting a few more. We are covering literally conception to death in 6 weeks. And that's challenging in itself. So this is a hybrid course. So half of the time you're in class and the other half of the time you'll have assignments and work like watching a video with the lecture or doing different assignments that you have ongoing. So the syllabus is already posted to Blackboard also. I'm going to build that as quickly as I can. I had to wait for IT to give me access. So we're going to just get started. You need to forgive me. I have bronchitis. So if I start to cough, I may mute myself and my picture for a moment, just so I don't cough in your ear. I guess it's better than COVID, right? But the cough just lingers on. So let's get started. Let me share my screen. Okay. Yeah. So this is lifespan development. As I said, we're using the Feldman book. If you have an older edition, or even if you have a different human growth and development book, a lifespan book, it's pretty much the same. So if the book's within 10 years, you would be fine. There's nothing that I'm going to assign like you need to read page 22, but you will need access to a human growth and development book or you won't be able to complete the assignments. Okay, so let's get started. When we talk about, just move this out of the way here. So when we talk about human growth and development, we're talking about this idea of what happens, growth patterns, what changes occur, how our behavior may change, not only physically, but we're going to look at cognitively and psychologically through each of the generations. And when we talk about this developmental approach, we use the scientific method. As you learned when you took intro to psychology, the reason that we are a science is because we follow the scientific method. So this is not something just haphazardly somebody thought up in their brain and thought, oh yeah, this is what it is. No, it's all been documented and revisited. And as we find new information, things change. So we're going to focus on human development. We do refer to some animal development because we did observe animal behavior for a long time and still do. And we can take that and expand it to human development. But there are some things that are universal that happen no matter where you're at in the world, no matter what culture you are, no matter what race you are, no matter what ethnicity you are. Those characteristics that we have as an individual, how we act as an individual or in a group. So we're going to look at that birth to death. That's a tough role to do. I'll tell you, it'll be easier the period of time you've already lived through. So like in my case, I'm in my 60s. And I've experienced all the things that we're going to be talking about in class up through people who are in their 60s. So it's always easier to remember that stuff. But you're all at least into young adulthood. So the first couple sections should be a piece of cake because you've actually lived through it. When we get beyond that, it might get a little more challenging because it's not something you've lived through, but you may remember your parents living through or your grandparents living through. So we're going to look at growth. We're going to look at stability, consistency. There's a continuous process, or is it kind of like stage development, like Piaget said? We're going to look at the physical makeup of the brain, nervous system, muscles, why we need food, why sleep is important. And you'll find a little bit about yourself too along the way, maybe some things you weren't familiar with before. We'll look at cognitive development, again, learning, memory, how we problem solve, what we say intelligence is, and how that's formed. We're also going to look at areas of development. So how that personality develops in one way for one person and one way for another person. We're going to look at societal influences, the power of the situation. How do those societal or group interactions help us to grow and change? And sometimes how it helps us to remain the same over time. The periods of time we're going to be looking at are these. We're going to talk about conception and birth, and then birth to 3, preschool, middle childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. Now, this is a wide range down here, 60 to death, because that really, in the 1920s, you were lucky if you were going to make it to 65 or 70. Now we have people living to be 100. So there's a lot of changes that can take place in that time. So that's kind of a large category. But we will move through these fairly rapidly, almost like 2 or 3 sections at a time. Don't get bogged down by all the information. You're not going to need to know every single point. The general scheme of things, your tests are multiple choice and short answer. And the final actually is part take home. So you'll be able to use your notes and PowerPoint and the internet and your book to fill out that section. But they're based on sections. So the first test will be on the first couple PowerPoints. The second test will be on the next couple PowerPoints. Anyway, your project, if you looked at the syllabus, is to interview or observe someone from each of these groups. So over the 5 weeks, you will have to find someone that you can either observe or interview. And that makes it a very interesting paper because it's actual, clinical research you're doing. You're talking to people, finding out if they're experiencing, all the stuff we studied about that age group. And for infants, of course, you're not going to be able to interview an infant, but you can watch them, or you could interview their parents and say, oh, what age did you see your child begin to crawl? Or what age did you notice that they would sit up and scoot on their behind? When did they start babbling? Things like that. So even though you may not be able to talk directly to the 1-year-old, you can find out information about them. Also, knowing that people mature at different rates. We're all different. Our genetic code, makes us who we are, but so does the environment. And there are some people that won't have their first period until they're 14 or 15. And there may be other girls that have their first period at 8. So, that idea that we mature differently, not only physically, but cognitively and emotionally and psychologically, that makes a big difference. At one time, adolescents went through the like till you were 25, because that's when your frontal cortex, I hate having this cough, sorry, frontal cortex is done developing. And there was even one research study that said in men, it doesn't stop developing until 27. But since it's only one research study and it hasn't been replicated yet, we're going to keep it with 25. It's also why your car insurance goes down at 25, because your frontal lobe takes care of all the executive functioning that you need, all your brain search, your motor skills, decision making, etc. But we used to label people adolescents until they were up to 25. And people were like, wait, there's a huge difference between an adolescent who's 13 and an adolescent who is 25. So they've changed the terminology, and the new terminology is called emerging adulthood. So that's like late teens, early 20s now falls into that category called emerging adult. So you'll see that terminology. If you would have an older book, say more than 15 years old, you would probably see them still labeled as adolescents. Okay. So, and there are also things that are different in each culture. To us, the thought of two children, and I do mean children, being wed is just unheard of. Like, oh my gosh, they didn't make any decision in this. Their parents, had this all planned, their children. We have adults that can't make decisions on who they want to be with, and they're still trying to figure out who they are. But that's part of culture. So culture, the environment can play a role on what goes on in our life. And then we're also going to look through, said the different aspects at the different ages: physical, cognitive, social, and personality. And you're going to see that pattern. Typically, I'll start with physical, then cognitive, social, personality. So that's the pattern you're going to see throughout the different PowerPoints that we're going to do. We'll be very specific sometimes, and sometimes we're going to look at the broad approach. Is this something that affects most of the population? Some definitions that you should know: cohort. When we talk about a cohort, we're talking about a group of people that were born around the same period of time. So when we do talk about that, let me share my screen again. Sorry, I had to log off for a second. So when we do talk about a cohort, we're talking about a group of people that were born around the same time in the same place. That means they have similar things that affected their development, things that would have happened at their age, things that would have happened because of the social content, etc. So people who were born in the age of 9/11, they have a different experience in their life than people that were born in 1940 or 1950. We have technology galore. 2000 was the first year for an iPod, and then iPhones and all that. My generation, even in the 80s, the only portable phones were these big things that were like a brick, and you were rich if you had one in your car. You didn't have this little portable thing that you can carry around, and basically a computer that has more information in it that you could possibly ever use in a lifetime. So all those things are going to affect the person. When we look at culture, ethnic, racial, socioeconomic, gender differences, racism, sexism, ageism, regrettably, all the rage. And some parts of the world more than others. But sure, that's going to have a factor, in who we become also. Things have changed. Some things are getting better, some are still stagnant, but we don't stop working on it. Psychologists know there are ways to help develop better race relations, better understanding of ethnic possible bias that people may have, age biased. An example would be, if you've ever gone to a store and you see a sign on the store, no more than teenagers allowed in the store at any one time. Like every single teenager is trying to steal something. Well, that's not fair. No, there are just as many adults that might be trying to steal something too, but they're not segregated from going into that store because of their age. So we'll talk about that too and how that affects development. It is, again, a scientific approach. We are covering conception to death, and we are looking at physical, cognitive, and personality. So that's just an overview. And you'll notice that in my PowerPoints, I do a basic overview and I actually have it in here. So when you go through the PowerPoints, if you miss something, usually in the little review section. And then what I do in my PowerPoints, I try to put in 1 or 2 questions here then, which would be an example of what could be a question on a test. So, like in this case, it's saying assumption made by lifespan developments focused on human development, an understanding of stability in addition to growth. And so it's asking you to fill in the blank. So that would be the typical setup of like a multiple choice question on the exam. So I throw a couple of those in after each section, just to give you an idea of what the exam would be like, the multiple choice part. When we talk about continuous and discontinuous change, which again, you may remember from intro to psychology, continuous change is gradual development. Something builds on top of one thing, off of another thing, etc. Discontinuous is a stage. In other words, when you get to this point, you think this way. And eventually you develop and you think a different way, but it's not built on what you've had before. It's just something that occurs. It's a stage. And it's around a set period of time when it occurs. Some people maybe just a little bit earlier or later, but it's always in that same order. You don't skip steps. So the difference between continuous and discontinuous. And also you should know the difference between a critical period of time and a sensitive period of time. Critical period of time means something occurs during that time that can have irreversible consequences. In other words, something has to happen at a certain time or the person is going to be affected in some great way. A sensitive period time is a time period where there could be an effect on the developing person. It's not always going to, be that thing that occurs, and it's not always going to happen in every person. An example like language development. There's a certain period of time that's a critical period of time that you have to hear or experience language, or you may not speak at all. That is different than a sensitive period of time. Say like mom is pregnant and mom decides she's going to drink alcohol during her pregnancy, but she's only drinking alcohol the first couple weeks and the last couple weeks of her pregnancy. There's a sensitive period of time where the alcohol could affect the developing fetus. Okay. So hopefully, and we'll get more detail than that when we get a little further into that part of the course. So many developmental psychologists focus on infancy to adolescence, but in reality, we realize there's a heck of a lot going on for the whole lifespan. So we're going to focus a little bit on each aspect, all those 7 major aspects of who we are all the way through death. That's always a great lecture. I get to talk about death. Everyone leaves the class depressed, so hopefully it won't be that bad. Let me just pause. So continuing on, you may have heard nature versus nurture, and that was a really big discussion point in the 70s and the 80s. But by the 90s, we have it pretty much figured out that it's both. People would argue, well, it's nature, our traits, our genetics, what we got from one parent or another, what was passed down genetically, that makes us who we are. Versus the environmental people, the nurture point of view that says, it's environmental influences that shape who we become, and it's not one or the other, it's both. It's something that's ongoing, as the slide says, a continuum. It's kind of a balancing act between the two. So both are necessary. Who makes us what we are is not only the genetic code that we got, our DNA from mom and our DNA from dad, but no, it also is our environment and how those two work together. So again, for the review, you should remember what continuous change is and discontinuous change, and make sure you understand what that is. You should know the difference between sensitive and critical period of time. And again, if it's a critical period of time, then there could be some irreversible consequences versus a sensitive period of time. And early development, again, we're focusing on nature and nurture. Then again, you can see the pattern. Here's a sample question that could be on the test. There's another one that can be on the test. Again, you have access to these PowerPoints on Blackboard. So if you can understand these basic concepts, you'll be fine. This might be a short answer question. So your test is going to be part multiple choice and part short answer. So looking at this question, what are some examples of ways, culture, either individual like here in Pittsburgh or broad culture, affect human development? So you would pull off from what we talked about, how those things can affect human development. And then you would give me a couple paragraphs on that. So that is basically the first part of the lecture. So I'm going to pause for one moment and we'll start again with 1.2. Okay, so we are ready for lecture 1.2. And let me share my screen. Okay. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to move into some more theoretical things. We're going to talk about the psychodynamic theory, the humanists, that's like Maslow and Carl Rogers, and just an overview of all the fundamentals. So this is just kind of an overview of what we're going to be doing. So let me pull this one other thing back. Tough trying to juggle a few things at the same time. Okay, so let me share my screen. Here we go. So let's look at the different approaches from a theoretical point of view. Psychodynamic, of course, is Freudian, and it talks about how what drives us is really motivated by inner conflicts that we have, things that we may have no control over. For Freud, there's conscious level, pre-conscious level, unconscious level. I always like to think of like an iceberg. The conscious level is kind of the peak of the iceberg that peaks out over the water. The pre-conscious level is just toward the base of the top of that water and right underneath. And then the unconscious level would be that whole rest of the iceberg. As you know, it's much larger than what you see poking through the water. So that's a good image to get in your mind when we talk about, what Freud thinks our actual personality is made of. It says there are three aspects: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id runs by the pleasure principle. It's the me, I want, gimme, gimme, gimme. I don't care who gets hurt along the way. The complete opposite that would be the superego. That's kind of our morality, our social thought. And that's, you try to do things for everyone else and you put yourself last. And then, of course, the ego, which is really kind of like a referee between the two, and that they are pretty much in balance because of the ego. It doesn't let the body do the two extremes. And at birth is the id. The ego develops shortly after that. And the superego doesn't really start to develop really in any contents until about 5 or 6, when we begin to learn right from wrong, and we'll continue to develop. And we learn our conscience, what's right and what's wrong, from our parents, our teachers, significant others. And, with today's day and age, media, we learn a lot from TV and movies and the internet. So that's part of it also. Freud says that there are 5 psychosexual stages: the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stage. So all of us are in the genital stage. There is nothing else beyond that. He says that each stage we must pass through, and in this order, there's a certain thing that gives us pleasure. There's a particular thing that we must pass through successfully, or we can get fixated. And like in times of stress, we could be fixated on one particular area. Oral stage, our mouth. Our mouth gives us pleasure. That's where food goes. If you've ever been around little children, everything they touch goes to their mouth. It's one of their big uses of their senses, is to just use their mouth. To our chagrin, when you see a little toddler pick up maybe a little tadpole and put it in his mouth, you're like, ah, but that's what happens, So oral stage, anal stage is toilet training. If you toilet train too early, there can be problems. If you toilet train too late, there can be problems. But it's the stage where children have control over something. They actually have more control at that stage than other times. Because if they decide they don't want to toilet train, they don't want to potty train, their parents are pretty much stuck, because this is the one thing that child has control over adults. They don't have money, they don't have pockets, they can't even make their own food, they can't drive a car, but they can make a difference if they're gonna go to the bathroom on a little pot, or if they're gonna go in a diaper, or if they're gonna just go in their pants. Phallic stage is 3 to 6. That's usually the stage where a lot of little kids will play doctor. That is perfectly normal. That is not abnormal. That's perfectly normal for them to be interested in, what the difference is between little boys and little girls biologically. So the phallic stage. The latency stage is from 5 to 6 years, and this is the stage where it begins just normal kids going to school, meeting friends, there's like no sexual gratification in this stage. It's just plain pleasure because you're a kid, you're enjoying yourself, you're meeting people, you're in school, etc. And then the genital stage, and that's the stage we're in. That means you receive most of your pleasure from your genitals, and that's something that will continue for the rest of your life, because that's his last stage. If you do get fixated in a stage. In other words, you don't pass successfully through a stage. So let's stay like the anal stage. There you had problems with toilet training. Freud says later on in life, when you're stressed out, you may have control issues, since that's the main thing that the anal stage is talking about, being in control. So maybe you know someone with OCD, or someone when they get stressed out, it's like they have to have all their ducks in a row. And if one of those ducks per se is out of the way, if something's wrong, they freak out. So good old picture of Sigmund Freud. Eric Erikson took that psychodynamic theory and split it into 8 parts. That's kind of what we look at here in the different stages. So human growth and development is basically this when we talk about psychologically what's going on in a person as they develop. So trust versus mistrust. You know, do you trust other people, or do you continue to move through life where you are untrustworthy, or you are untrustful of other people, and there are people that are untrustworthy in your life? So you know, have to fight about who you're going to be friends and who you want to be in a relationship with, or who you want to work with, etc. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. You know, all children try things, right? If they get yelled at or screamed at, they may not want to try it again. So this is a really important stage where children have a little bit of freedom, and parents need to give them a little bit of freedom, not full carte blanche. You know, you don't want to give a kid, you know, here you have complete access to the house. Here's matches. Go ahead, light up a storm. No, but you do have to give them, you know, some opportunity to do something free of choice. Would you like a cup of juice? Here, I have a paper cup. You can go get it yourself. Something as simple as that can build on that autonomy. Initiative versus guilt, you know, trying new things versus being shamed for doing it. There was one TV commercial where a kid was taking a 2-liter bottle of pop, and he shook it up, not realizing what it was going to do. And he opened it up and it sprayed all over the kitchen. And his mother's like, Billy. And the kid is like cowering. And the mother thought quickly, she just turned around and she grabbed a little spray hose and go, oh, this works better. And she sprayed him, and they were laughing, and they got their bounty paper towels and cleaned up the whole kitchen together. But that could have been a really negative experience. So looking at that situation, the parent handled it, according to Erickson, in the right way to push for, you know, that initiative instead of the kid being guilty. Industry versus inferiority. Industry, doing things, trying things, feeling good about yourself and your accomplishments. Of course, inferiority means that you don't feel good about yourself. Identity versus role confusion. We start to see this in adolescence. Who am I? What am I doing? What do I believe? You know, do I believe the same thing my parents did? What am I willing to stand up for? That goes into early adulthood, or what we would consider emerging adulthood and on. Intimacy versus isolation. Remember, in psychology, intimacy doesn't mean sex. That means, you know, relationship, you know, our relationship we have. So you're willing to share yourself, your ideas, your hopes, your dreams, and maybe sex with the other individual sometime, or are you going to stay to yourself? Generativity versus stagnation. We see this around the 40s, maybe late 40s, early 50s. Giving back. Are you willing to give back to others, to do things? You drive your kids to ballet, you drive your kids to baseball, you You're helping your parents, you're helping your neighbors, you're cutting grass for, your neighbor who broke their leg. I mean, that's generativity. Stagnation is no, I don't want to do it. I'm all to myself. And then the last one is ego integrity, and usually it's just said integrity versus despair. And that's late adulthood because that's talking about toward the end of life. Can you look back on your life and say, yeah, I led a pretty good life, and you will die with integrity? And if you look back on your life and you made some poor choices and they're choices that you can't change now, you will die in despair, according to Erickson. So each stage, again, there's a pattern, something has to be resolved. And when we look at that perspective, it's not quite Freud's theory. Freud did very little research. He worked with white, rich women from Vienna and applied his theory to everyone. So Erickson's view is a more lifelong view, and it does have some support behind it in each section. It focuses on men more than women, which is nothing unusual at that time period. And it gives some predictions of the future, but not necessarily accurate predictions in all cases. When we look at a behavioral perspective, so we're coming like from the B.F. Skinners, the Pavlovs, you know, those developmental researchers. We're looking at, again, different stages that people may pass through, different activities. John Watson and his classical conditioning, how children may be conditioned to fear something or try to control something in the environment. And what Rogers did was he had a little toddler named Little Albert, and he wanted to see if he could condition him to be fearful of something that he was never fearful of before. So what he did was present Little Albert a white rat. And Little Albert didn't make any sound or anything. It was perfectly fine. But we all know if a little child hears a loud noise, it scares them. Oh, they're fearful. So what he did right before he presented the right white rat, he hit a gong behind the child. So the child jumped, was startled, and started to cry, and then presented the rat. Well, it didn't take long for the child, Little Albert, to pair that negative stimuli, the loud gong, with the rat, and became afraid of white rats that generalized to white bunnies, dogs with white fur coats, to a white fur coat, to men with white beards. Bad thing with Watson's research is they never deconditioned this. They never did desensitization training on the child. So the child probably went through life being fearful of all these things, like with white fur. Operant conditioning is the B.F. Skinner approach. Remember Skinner and his little boxes where the rat had to push the button? Again, you tend to do things that are reinforced in some way. So if you do a behavior, you get some sort of reward. If you don't do, you may get some sort of punishment or extinguish the behavior. That can happen very, very easily. Say you're in Walmart and your kid is crying because you told them they could get a candy bar if they're good, except this is the day after Halloween and they have an entire bag of candy at home. So you tell them, nope, you have candy at home. We'll get it when you get home. And the next thing you know, your kid's on the ground kicking and screaming, having a fit. And you need to make a decision, and this is an important decision on what you do. Do you let them kick and scream? Do you take them out of the store, or do you bend down and hand them a candy bar and go, shh, Here, you go. No, stop it. Because if you just gave them that candy bar, you have just conditioned that behavior. You just reinforced it, and you're going to see that behavior more and more. Then there's Albert Bandura, and he is known for the Bobo doll experiment. That's those big blow-up dolls that look like a clown that you punch and they swing back and forth. He wanted to see if you could learn something from the environment, something distinctly like aggression. So little children watched older children beat up on these Bobo dolls. And the little kids, once the older kids left, went right over and did the exact same thing, what they observed. So observational learning, okay? We're not just a black box. We can figure out where things came from. If you have a phobia, let's say you're afraid of car doors, something happened in your life to make you afraid of a car door. You know, if you're afraid of snakes, you could say that's a biological thing. It's really hard to be afraid of a car door. So there's usually some behavioral connection to what happened for that fear. And then when we look at the cognitive perspective, we're looking at Piaget. Again, Piaget had 4 stages that he says that we move through one at a time. And let me do this for a second. So Piaget then was talking about these stages that you move through. So first, we want to talk about Piaget and schemas. And schemas are ways that Piaget describes us learning new material. Says they're in our long-term memory. And every time we do something, if it's similar to what we already have in long-term memory, we make an assimilation by just adding something to it. If it's completely different, we make an accommodation. That means we have to make a complete change. Example, if you went to a bathroom at Allegheny campus and the lights weren't on, the first place you would look would be the wall, right? To turn on the light. And you would feel around and turn on the wall, a little light on the wall. And maybe it's a little further down than you expected, but it's still on the wall. That would be assimilation. For that bathroom, you know you have to reach down a little further to get to the light switch. But if you're at South Campus, G building, ground floor, if you go into the bathroom there, there's no light switch on the wall at all. You have to walk in 6.5 feet for the sensor to pick up that there's a body there for it to turn on the lights for exactly 9.5 minutes. Now, if you've never been there, how would you know that, right? You could try looking on the wall you don't know. I can't tell you how many people I've seen walk out of that bathroom to just go to another bathroom. It's the only bathroom like that on all of South Campus, and I don't know of any of the other campuses that have one too. But let's say that happened to you, and for some reason you thought to walk in. You would make an accommodation to your existing schema that for that bathroom, you have to walk in 6.5 feet. You wouldn't come back to Allegheny when the lights are off and walk in the bathroom 6.5 feet or feet waiting for the lights to come on, because there's a switch on the wall here at Allegheny. So you make an accommodation just for that particular situation. Piaget's theories are somewhat sound, but he realized, and as they were replicated, that there are some age differences. There are some children that develop earlier. They still go through all the stages, but they develop much earlier. The information processing people say that we learn by information being coded. So information go in and information comes out. So it comes basic from that computer model. What we put in is what's going to affect our behavior coming out. So that would be the people who think, if you watch a violent TV show, that you're going to become a violent person. And we know that's not true necessarily either. When we talk about neuroscience, they don't look at things like creativity and do these people grow plants and do they make friends? Do they work well in a group? No, they don't look at that at all. They're just looking straight cognitively what's going on. So our cognitive neuroscientists, these are the ones that make six figures. So if you're looking to go into psychology and you want to make money, this is the field right now that's doing it. These are the people that research what's going on in the brain and why are things happening. Things like people who fall along the autism spectrum, people who have, Down syndrome, people who are challenged in any way. This is, some of the stuff is cutting edge and some of the stuff that we still don't know yet. We still don't know what causes autism. We do know that it's been increased like 50-fold in the last 30 years. We don't know why. So we're still learning, but it is cutting edge stuff. And yes, there is some brain size matter. Yeah, if you have the intelligence of a small fish versus a human, we have the ability to use our brain. Children who have who fall on the autism spectrum just may have one part of that affecting their brain. In other words, I have a friend who has Asperger's and they can speak 7 languages. I'm lucky I can do 3, but they can speak 7 languages clearly, but they don't have any skills for interaction. So if they come up to someone to introduce themselves, they literally get right in your face, that personal space. Hi, how are you? And it freaks people out. So there are different things that are affected as part of your disorder. So these next couple slides are just review slides like we did before. And again, some sample questions that you may want to look at. That would be something on the test. When we look at the humanists, these are the Carl Rogers and the Abraham Maslow people. When we look at Carl Rogers, that's a need for unconditional positive regard. That's another long term for self-esteem. But we should always say good things about ourselves. One of my pet peeves with my students is if they do something wrong, they made a mistake, they'll say, my bad. And the humanist in me comes out, no, you're not bad. You made a mistake, but you personally are not a bad person. So the humanists are always looking for the positive, that you should say positive things about yourself. This is the guy who started the whole lunchbox movement with leaving little notes in the lunchbox for your kids, for putting the stuff up on the refrigerator, even if it looks really terrible, just as like the refrigerator becomes the place of honor, etc. Maslow says that there's a hierarchy of needs. In order to achieve a goal, you need to have the basic needs met. Now, that doesn't mean you can't meet them if you don't have the basic needs met. It just means that it's a little harder. So it's really hard to do the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared plus c squared, if you didn't have dinner or, the night before or breakfast in the morning and you're in the room and you're starving and your teacher's up there going a squared plus b squared, you're not focusing the same way you would if you had dinner or a good breakfast. And that's why so many of our schools present the opportunity for kids to get breakfast, free lunch, or free breakfast at the schools. And one of the reasons why our city schools don't close on the drop of a hat when it comes to snow, because they know if they close, there are kids that won't eat at night. So when we look at the humanist, we're looking at a broad range of behavior, meeting our needs, going from just basic needs like air, water, food, to self-actualization, to be the best that you can be. Yes, Maslow had his little phrase, stolen by the army. So they use that phrase, but that's it, to be the best that we can be. And then we have the Bowlberry, the cultural approach of our environment. So micro, meso, ecto, macro, chrono. I'm not going to have you know each of those in so much detail. You should just be familiar. So the microsystem are those immediate people that you deal with. Meso is the next group, so that's kind of your community. Exo, all the way out through, the time period that you're living in and part of the world that you're living in. So we will look at different levels of development on each of these stages that we're going to go through. You may have heard of Lee Vygotsky. He would have been the opposite of Piaget because he thought that children learned from interactions. He would have been a huge component of recess and play. Actually talks about all the different types of play in his theory and how we learn from that. We know so many kids are stuck in front of a screen right now. You're doing that as we're talking. We're not really engaging because you don't have the opportunity to ask the questions when I'm on the screen filming. But it's the same thing. Many of our children don't have an opportunity to engage with other children in the world, other kids their age, even some kids that are younger or older. They just don't have the opportunity, so they choose not to. Well, where's it go when you need to have relationship and know how to empathize with someone or know how to work with someone? So we do see that as an issue right now. But Vygotsky says, culture, our environment has a huge impact on who we become. And then the evolutionary perspective, which this is going to sound like an oxymoron, that it's one of our newest approaches. I know, evolutionary, it doesn't make any sense, but we're looking at what could have been passed down genetically and is passed down in all generations. And we know from Darwin, survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest doesn't mean that you only have adapted. It means you've adapted and been able to pass on your genetic code to the next generation, because you can have all the adaptations you want, but if you don't reproduce and pass it on, it dies with you. So, when we look at genetic inheritance, we're looking at the things that were adapted. And does that material get passed on to the next generation because it was genetically sent through reproduction? The critics of evolutionary perspective, it's really hard to test these theories because we weren't around hundreds of years ago, so we really don't know. There's not a lot of information out there right now, and I don't know if we'll ever get that information. So which approach is right or wrong? There isn't one approach. People have their preference: psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, and humanistic, contextual, and evolutionary. Most people have more than one that they kind of make a combination, their own thing. So it's kind of eclectic. That's a good way. Like there are some parts of the humanist and the behavioral approach that I love, but there's some things in Freud's theory, not all of it, but there are some little things of Freud's theory that still make sense, like defense mechanisms, like denial and repression. you know, I may not be a psychodynamic theory, a specialist, but I do, see that there's some benefit to that approach. The humanist haven't had a major impact on lifespan development. That doesn't mean they don't have any effect at all, but it's not as much as we would think. Self-actualization is important. It tells us that we never stop learning and we never stop becoming the best that we can be. And again, the rest of the review just goes over the things that we just talked about. And, oops, sorry. And then we would have our questions, just like that pattern that I've followed before. And if we were going to do an essay question on the test, what examples of human behavior have you seen that seem to have been inherited from our ancestors because they helped individuals survive and adapt more efficiently? Why do you think they are inherited? So you would just talk about being inherited and giving an example of that. And that is it. So at that point, I'm going to stop this video. I'm going to upload this. So this is lectures 1.1 and 1.2. And I will continue on other ones, but let's get this uploaded to you. And if you have any questions, you can either email me. You could also text me. My number's on the syllabus. And otherwise, I will be seeing you on Wednesday for class. Have a great day and a nice weekend.